March 15, 1944, 25,000 feet above Berlin. The outside air temperature was 65 below zero, cold enough to punish bare skin in seconds. Captain William Overeat, North Carolina farm country in his bones, felt his P-51 Mustang shudder as cannon fire tore past his right wing, close enough that the slipstream seemed to flinch. The Messerschmitt 109 behind him wasn't just chasing. It was hunting with skill. Overeat had been in the air war long enough to recognize talent when it tried to kill him. The German pilot was disciplined, patient, pressing at angles that forced Overeat to keep bleeding speed, forcing him to keep trading altitude for survival. A lesser pilot would have panicked. Overeat didn't. He had something the German didn't know about yet. Inside his wings sat a full belt of armor-piercing incendiary. 50 caliber ammunition, rounds designed not merely to punch holes, but to start fires that refused to die. 6 months earlier, the 8th Air Force's bomber crews were dying at a rate that made the men in Washington stare at the charts like they were looking at a death sentence. Some missions bled 30% losses. The math was brutal. Keep losing crews like that, and you'd run out of trained men before you ran out of targets. B-17 flying fortresses pushed into Germany at 160 miles per hour. Massive, steady, predictable. The Luftwaffe had learned how to kill them efficiently. Fighters came from 12 o'clock high, where defensive guns had the worst angles. They poured 20mm shells into cockpits and noses and washed 11 tons of aluminum and tin boys from Kansas and Brooklyn and Ohio spiraled down, still strapped inside. By late 1943, German fighter bases in France and Holland had gotten comfortable. They had real coffee. They had confidence. They had kill boards that looked like scoreboards. One of the names written in chalk again and again belonged to Major Hans Kersner of Munich. 43 bomber kills. His method was simple and vicious. Ignore the defensive guns. Come straight in. Aim for the pilots. Fire everything at once. A few 50 caliber hits might pepper his aircraft, sure, but his cannon shells carved holes the size of dinner plates. He'd told a wingman over schnapps that fighting Americans was like hunting cattle. Big, slow cattle that flew in straight lines. Then the Mustangs arrived. December 1943, England. The first P-51s began appearing on cold, muddy airfields like greyhounds among draft horses. Mechanics from Detroit and St. Louis and Philadelphia walked around them with the quiet awe of men who recognized engineering that belonged to the future. The Merlin engine, British blood in an American airframe, could push a Mustang past 430 miles per hour in the right conditions. But speed wasn't what terrified German pilots most. Range was. With drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. 1,400 miles, round trip. No more turning back at the edge of German airspace and leaving the bombers alone for the worst 600 miles of their lives. For the first time, the bombers had teeth all the way to the target. And then there were the bullets. A standard 50 caliber round was already lethal, a slug of metal traveling fast enough to drill through aluminum like paper. But the new API ammunition changed the nature of air combat. A chemist, one of those quiet, precise men the war hid behind lab doors, explained it in plain language. Imagine a bullet that could pierce armor and then burn like a miniature furnace. Hit a fuel tank, even a self-sealing one, and you didn't just leak, you ignited. Hit an oxygen line, and you fed the fire like a bellows. Hit an engine, and you turned the machine's insides into molten failure. The Germans discovered this the hard way during Big Week, February 1944, when Allied bombers went after aircraft factories in waves. Lieutenant James Morrison, Texas drawl and a deadly calm, watched a formation of Ju-88s trying to attack the American bombers like wolves circling a herd. Morrison brought his 4 Mustangs down out of the sun, firing short, disciplined bursts. The first API hits looked unimpressive for a heartbeat. Then an engine turned orange. Flames crawled along a wing faster than any sane man expected. The incendiary compound burned hot enough to melt aluminum, hot enough to turn fuel lines into fuses. The Ju-88 rolled over and began to fall, trailing fire like a comet. Parachutes blossomed, 2 of them. The other men inside never made it out. After Leipzig, stories spread through every German ready room. Not shot down, burned. There was a difference, and German pilots understood it with an animal fear. A damaged aircraft might limp home. A burning aircraft at altitude was a coffin with a timer. Kersner heard the reports sitting in a ready room outside Munich. 15 bombers destroyed in minutes. Crews trapped by smoke and fire. Pilots bailing out with their gloves already melting. The tone of the stories wasn't outrage or pride anymore. It was dread. By March, the Luftwaffe had started changing tactics. No more straight-in bomber attacks unless necessary. Avoid Mustangs. Wait for gaps. Slash and dive. Hit and run. But the Mustangs had learned too. American pilots throttled back, flew fuel conservation profiles, stretched their range until they could stay over Berlin with enough time to fight, not just escort. The idea that a fighter could loiter over Germany, could hunt, was new, and it was killing German confidence in ways no statistic could fully capture. The first great test came on March 6, 1944, the first major American raid on Berlin. 660 bombers, 800 fighters, Mustangs weaving above the bomber stream like guardians with knives. Overeat flew Yellow 3 with the 357th Fighter Group, engine humming, oxygen mask frosting at the edges, his body already aching from hours in the harness. At 27,000 feet the air was thin and sharp. Contrails hung behind every aircraft like white scars across the sky. That was when he saw them, 12 Bf-109s climbing hard from the south, trying to get above the bombers for a diving attack. They were high-quality pilots, too, unit markings that spoke of experience and pride. Overeat called them out and pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin responded instantly, the Mustang climbing like it was eager. The merge happened near 29,000 feet. Aircraft flashed past each other at closing speeds that left no room for hesitation, only instinct. Overeat picked a 109 lining up on a straggling B-17 and squeezed the trigger. The Mustang shook as all 6 guns fired. Convergence set at 300 yards, 6 streams of rounds meeting at one point like a spear. The API hits punched through behind the cockpit, right where the fuel tank lived. For a fraction of a second, nothing. Then the 109 became a torch. Fire erupted in a sudden, violent bloom, spreading as if the aircraft had been dipped in flame. The pilot bailed out immediately, his parachute opening dangerously close to the burning wreck. Silk fluttered, scorched at the edges by heat. Another 109 came from Overeat's 7 o'clock. Cannon rounds snapped past his canopy. Overeat broke hard, pulling GS until the world narrowed and went gray. When vision returned, the German had overshot. One mistake, one moment. Overeat fired a short burst. The 109's engine exploded, cowling fragments whipping past like shrapnel. The German fighter nosed down into a steep dive, propeller windmilling into stillness. The sky over Berlin became a battlefield spread across 50 cubic miles. Below, smoke rose from the city like a bruise. Ahead, the bomber stream pushed on, inexorable. Behind and above and beside, fighters fought a different war, angles, energy, seconds. And somewhere in that chaos, Overeat realized the truth. The air war had tilted. It wasn't just courage versus courage anymore. It was reach and firepower and chemistry, technology that turned a good hit into a burning verdict. He still had 90 minutes of fuel to get home. He still had more Germans climbing to meet the bombers. He still had his guns. And the bullets in those belts were no longer just ammunition. They were the new rulebook. Major Hans Kersner understood what had happened long before the official reports were typed and stamped. You didn't need a staff briefing to feel it. You felt it in the air, in the way pilots now hesitated, in the way attacks broke off seconds too early. That hesitation was new, and it was deadly. The Luftwaffe technical officers gathered pilots in cold briefing rooms and explained the American ammunition with grim precision. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds. White phosphorus compounds that burned at temperatures no aircraft aluminum could withstand. Thermite mixtures that didn't just ignite fuel. They consumed structure, melted control runs, fed on oxygen itself. These rounds didn't behave like bullets. They behaved like fire starters with teeth. The numbers were worse than the stories. In January 1944, before the Mustangs appeared in force, German fighters were downing roughly 5 American bombers for every fighter lost. By April, that ratio had flipped completely. Now 3 German fighters were being destroyed for every bomber lost, and the fighters weren't just damaged. They were burned out of existence. A mathematician attached to Luftwaffe headquarters ran the projections. At current loss rates, Germany would exhaust its pool of experienced fighter pilots by late summer. Aircraft could be built faster than pilots could be trained, but burned pilots could not be replaced at all. The psychological damage spread faster than the physical destruction. Pilots who had once pressed attacks regardless of odds now flinched at the first tracer coming back toward them. Some loosened their parachute straps before engaging, ready to bail out the moment smoke appeared. That split second, just a fraction of hesitation, was often enough for a Mustang to get its shot. Captain William Overeat saw it from the other side of the guns. On March 23rd, escorting bombers toward Frankfurt, he watched a Messerschmitt 110 break off an attack after taking only a brief burst. The twin-engine fighter hadn't exploded. It hadn't even lost altitude. But the pilot had seen smoke, smelled chemicals, felt heat, and that was enough. The crew bailed out minutes later when the hydraulic system failed and the landing gear dropped without command. One engine hit. 20 API rounds. Aircraft finished. The Mustang ground crews understood the effect better than anyone. One mechanic, formerly a Ford engine man, explained it to new pilots in plain language. Regular bullets poke holes. These burn through the hole and keep burning. You don't just damage something, you ruin it. German fighters that appeared to escape combat often didn't. Engines seized 10 minutes later. Oil lines failed. Control cables warped. Pilots bailed out over forests or cities they'd hoped to defend, watching their aircraft die without enemy pursuit. By late March, Luftwaffe directives had grown blunt. Avoid Mustangs whenever possible. Do not turn fight. If hit by incendiary ammunition, abandon the aircraft immediately. Orders like that were unheard of from an air force that had once preached aggression above all else. Overeat completed his 25th mission in early April. By regulation, he should have gone home. 25 missions meant survival. It meant rotation, rest, life. He stayed. His crew chief called it madness. Those bullets burned both ways, Captain. Germans are using incendiaries too. Overeat knew. He'd seen Mustangs come back with scorched wings and blistered paint. He'd seen pilots roll inverted and fire their guns empty just to starve internal fires before the ammunition cooked off. He'd seen how thin the margin was. But he also saw the bomber formations coming home more intact than ever before. By May 1944, 8th Air Force bomber losses had dropped dramatically. Hundreds of crews who would have died 6 months earlier were now alive, walking away from damaged aircraft, writing letters home, complaining about cold coffee instead of being buried in foreign soil. The Mustangs didn't stop at escort. Once the bombers turned west, fighters dropped low and went hunting. German airfields burned. Trains vanished in rolling firestorms. Fuel convoys became funeral pyres. One strafing run with API rounds could block a rail line for hours, sometimes days. On April 13th, Lieutenant Robert Johnson learned just how dangerous that ammunition could be to friend and foe alike. Flak fragments punched into his wing during a strafing run, igniting API rounds inside the ammunition bay. Fire bloomed where no fire should exist, inside the aircraft. Johnson reacted instantly. He rolled inverted and fired everything. 5 seconds of continuous fire emptied the wing. When the guns fell silent, the fire died. The Mustang limped home, wing warped, paint burned away from the inside out. Another 2 seconds, and the aircraft would have disintegrated. By late April, German airfields were littered with blackened shapes that had once been fighters. Earth revetments didn't help. Incendiary rounds bounced, tumbled, burned wherever they landed. Smoke columns marked destroyed aircraft like gravestones visible for miles. Major Kersner returned to combat that same month with a replacement aircraft and a half-trained squadron. He faced Mustangs near Friedrichshafen and barely survived. One burst of API rounds set his aircraft burning behind the cockpit. He bailed out immediately, fingers numb, lungs screaming in frozen air, watching his fighter spiral down trailing fire. Hanging under his parachute, freezing, helpless, he understood the truth with perfect clarity. This was no longer about skill alone. This was about who could ignite the other first. By May, the Luftwaffe was bleeding out. Replacements arrived with barely 100 flight hours. Some froze in combat. Some stalled under pressure. Some collided trying to evade. Veterans like Kersner watched boys die in seconds, unable to save them. Overeat flew on. He flew escort. He flew strafing runs. He flew missions that blurred together until dates stopped matching. He watched German fighters break off without firing. He watched others burn so fast there was no chance of escape. The war in the air had transformed. It was no longer a duel. It was ignition. The end came not with a single battle, but with exhaustion. By June 1944, the sky over Western Europe belonged to the Mustangs. The Luftwaffe still flew, but only in fragments. Small groups. Desperate sorties. Pilots sent up with orders they knew they couldn't fulfill. The days of mass German interceptions were over. What remained was attrition, slow and merciless. Major Hans Kersner felt it on the morning of June 6th. The sirens began before dawn, not the localized alarms of another raid, but a continuous wail stretching from airfield to airfield. When he reached the operations room, the map was already crowded with markers, thousands of them. Allied aircraft over Normandy, transport planes, fighters, bombers, everything the Allies had. His squadron was ordered to attack the invasion fleet. 6 Messerschmitts against a sky that looked alive. They took off anyway. They never reached the coast. 20 miles out, Mustangs dropped out of the sun. API tracers burned bright red through the gray sky, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. One burst stitched across Kersner's wing. The metal didn't just tear, it ignited. The instrument panel bloomed with fire. Aluminum burned. Wiring burned. The cockpit filled with smoke that clawed at his lungs. He didn't remember bailing out, only falling. When he came to, he was lying in a French wheat field, his parachute tangled in the stalks, Canadian paratroopers standing over him with rifles. Smoke columns rose in every direction. Burning aircraft, burning fuel, burning futures. One of the Canadians looked at the sky and said quietly, "Your Air Force is finished." By noon, he was right. The Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft that day. Many never fired a shot. Many burned before they could even turn. The combination of long-range escort and incendiary ammunition had turned the invasion air battle into an execution. Captain William Overeat flew 3 missions on D-Day. He escorted gliders. He strafed German gun positions. He hunted fighters that never came. On one mission, he caught an ammunition train trying to reach the front. The API rounds found the cars carrying shells. The explosion erased the train and a quarter-mile of track with it. Secondary detonations burned for nearly half an hour. By July, finding German fighters had become difficult. The Luftwaffe was conserving what few experienced pilots remained. When they did appear, they struck once and fled. Staying meant burning. On July 7th, Overeat nearly died proving the point. Flak ignited API rounds inside his wing during a strafing run. Fire bloomed where no fire should exist. Remembering another pilot's report, he rolled inverted and fired everything, emptying his guns in a single desperate burst. The fire died. The Mustang survived. The wing did not. Inspectors later found 5 API rounds had cooked off internally. 2 seconds more and the aircraft would have disintegrated. The invasion broke out. German armies collapsed. Mustangs ranged freely, turning rail yards, airfields, and supply depots into smoking ruins. The Luftwaffe was no longer a fighting force. It was a memory being erased one burning aircraft at a time. Overeat's luck ended on September 10th over Cologne. Flak tore through his Mustang. The engine ignited instantly. Incendiary compounds fed the fire faster than he could react. He bailed out at low altitude, landing hard and breaking his ankle. From the ground, he watched his aircraft explode against a hillside, igniting trees in a ring of flame. A German officer captured him and looked at the wreckage. "You're incendiary bullets," the man said quietly. "We burn you. You burn us. Everyone burns." Overeat spent the rest of the war in Stalag Luft 3, watching Mustangs escort bomber streams day after day, watching guards grow thinner, watching Germany collapse. After the war, he went home, married, ran a hardware store, raised children, but the smell never left him. Burning aluminum, burning fuel, burning men. Major Hans Kersner survived too. He returned to Munich to find his city reduced to ash by incendiary bombing. Of 60 pilots he'd flown with, 8 survived. At a conference years later, he met Overeat again. They spoke quietly over whiskey about airplanes, about ammunition, about how quickly the war had changed. "It wasn't tactics," Kersner said at last. It was fire. You learned how to make aircraft burn. After that, everything else followed. The statistics confirmed it. API ammunition increased aircraft kills by nearly half. Pilot losses rose even higher. The Luftwaffe collapsed not just because of numbers, but because fear entered the cockpit. One hit meant fire. Fire meant death. That knowledge changed how pilots fought and how they hesitated. The P-51 Mustang became legend. The API round became a footnote. But for the men who fought in 1944, those burning bullets were not a detail. They were the moment the sky turned into a furnace, when air combat stopped being a duel and became an ignition race. Victory came faster because of it. Lives were saved because of it. And lives were lost in ways no one ever forgot. That was the price of winning the air war.